Okay, I think we are. I think we are. I think we're live.
Excellent.
Been trying it now for a while. Good morning, everybody. My name's Amy. I'm the dietista. I'm a nutritionist with over 13 years experience helping people calm their digestive health and be the boss of their bodies. Today I have with us David Bird. He is a cognitive hypnotherapist, and he specialises in stress, anxiety and mindset. And I've got David on today because I've spoke to an unprecedented amount of people off the back of my Heal Digestive Pain event. And stress and anxiety is a big factor in a lot of your lives. And with the way that our society is and with the way our day-to-day life is, we need to find ways to manage it. If one, we're going to be happier, but two, we're not going to, damage our internal biochemistry, because it's all completely linked and it has a massive impact on our digestion. So I was speaking to David earlier on in the week, and he's a nice chap. And we were just talking about like stress and anxiety and your mindset around it. I am not the expert on this. So what I am going to do is I'm going to hand you over to David, and he can tell you a little bit about, his story and how we can use like tools to help us with our stress and anxiety in a very, very busy, stressful at the moment world. Hi, David.
Hi, Amy.
Hello. How you doing?
I'm good. Well, apart from what we were saying this morning about, which is quite relevant in terms of stress, I went for a run, like I try and do most mornings, and managed to lose my keys, saving a crayfish.
As you do.
As you do. There's
So,
a crayfish.
what
Sorry?
was going on with this crayfish? So what did
I
you
was
try
I
and
was
do?
running down the canal, and there was a crayfish there, and I was like, "That's not supposed to be there." And I thought someone's probably going to run or ride their bike over him, so I thought should probably stop and pick him up. But I have my keys on a key ring around my finger on my glove, so I had to take this off and picked up the crayfish and grabbed my glove as it would, because it's a crayfish.
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to find somewhere in the canal to put it back in, but not just throw it in the water. So anyway, I did that, but I must have got confused and put my gloves back on, finish my run, and then I get so far back and I'm like, damn it, I haven't got my key. So then I'm like, I've got to talk to Amy. How's this going to work? So I run back, and so for me, it made me laugh, because I'm starting to think, am I going to get back in time? Like, what am I going to do? What am I going to? And then I remembered that my neighbour had keys. So I was like, well, I'm going to have to. So I had to look for a bit, but then I had to make the decision. You know, I'm just going to leave the keys, and I'm going to and I have to knock on my neighbour's house to get the spare keys and to come in, and then it was fine. But in the past, that kind of thing would have really, really stressed me out.
Yeah. So what kind of changed? What has changed from like then to now, for instance? Because I've lost my keys too when I've been out on a run. I can't run so much anymore because my knees unfortunately don't like it. But I've also lost my keys, and I didn't have a spare set. And I was running around the countryside in Hertfordshire, so they literally could have been absolutely anywhere.
Not
And I had to, and it was before work, and I was working from home at the time, and I needed to log back on and start my day, but I couldn't get into my house, so that was kind of scarpered. And I remember being like a little bit. I thankfully had my phone, and I messaged my boss to kind of say, "Guess what I've done." And he was really cool about it, so that kind of helped. But in a situation whereby, that is a little bit of a stress, you've got stuff to do, and you've got like a deadline, you've got a time limit, which is really, really relevant, because that's what a lot of us work on. We haven't got time. There's a lot of pressure to get to a certain point or get a target like complete, or so what kind of is different from you from like X amount of time ago until now?
For me, it's about, if we start all the way back at the beginning, it's how you define stress.
Mm-hmm.
So the way our brains are set up really is to think that stress comes from the things outside of us. And we hear that in our language, right? You hear people say things like, oh, I've had a really stressful day at work, or it was really stressful that I lost my keys, right? But it's not, the stress doesn't come from that thing. The stress comes from the thinking about it.
Mm.
It's what that thing means to us. So you can have, because you can have, you can have two people that work for the same boss, for example, and maybe that boss is particularly difficult or particularly, you know, uh, particular in the way they like things done. But
Mm-hmm.
one person could just get on with it, and then you've got the other person who finds them very stressful. So you have to look at, well, why, if they've got the same boss, why are they dealing with them differently? And it comes back to what that means to them. And it's, if you look underneath it, it tends to be the people's beliefs about themselves, what they think is possible, what they're capable of. So we take your example. So when you lost your keys, I'm guessing that you foresaw the consequences of being a bit late back were not going to be too great, and you felt okay enough to text your boss. That was possible for you to text your boss, and I'm guessing you thought you weren't going to lose your job over it.
Yeah, no, they know me very well, so they probably just went.
Yeah. So you've got this situation where it's like, my expectation hasn't met reality. Like, I now have to. I'm now stuck with this problem. Here's what I plan to do. I now have to change the plan. And what you did is you had to accept that you had to make a change, and then you had to do something different, right? But you did
Yeah.
something about it.
Yeah.
That's the formula for not having stress. But when we have all this other thinking in the way, that's where stress can come. So let's say that you said it was, well, I can't text my boss because my boss is going to be really angry at me and he'll be disappointed, and I can't deal with that. But I also can't find there's also no other way that I can get into my house. And even if I do get into my house, then my project's going to be late and XYZ, and that's going to be a big problem. If you've got all this thinking, all these beliefs, if you like, about the things that's going to mean, and also if you're in a position of, and I can't do anything about that, and anything I can do is not going to help, that's where the stress will come from.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, I was very fortunate. I mean, there was a moment of that, when you go into panic and then instantly, like, the worst case scenarios just start going through your head, don't they? You can't help them. But yeah, so like I did go into that. So there was an element of, oh no, I'm not going to be able to do this. I was responsible for doing this straight away, logging on, checking environments, because I was like in IT support at the time, logging on, checking environments. I'm now going to have to rely on one of my colleagues who's already really, really busy to kind of do that for me. And so there was that. I did have that feeling of the burden of my mistake and what the impact that would have on other people. But then I suppose I was also blessed to know that my boss, he was amazing. He was like a really great guy. And also, like, my colleagues that I was working with were brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So they would have probably just called me an idiot, and I hope you find your keys. And then and then and then they'd be like, no worries, we'll just do that for you. But instantly I went, oh my god, this burden, it's going to be awful for them. But in reality, they're like, go find your keys, you idiot. Everything is fine, we'll just take it and log on when you can. Hope you find them, let us know how it goes. So it's that mix of being able to, in a time of like absolute panic, be able to switch your minds to a more rational way of thinking, which is kind of hard, which is really, really hard. And like, I know, like in other jobs where, that's an example of me working, thankfully, in quite a comfortable environment. So I know people are supportive and helpful of my Amyisms. But, it hasn't always been that case. So, I've been in other, jobs, and I've made huge error, and or error. I have made huge error, but like, even though I've just made like, moderate, like normal human error, I kind of throw myself into panic, absolute panic. And it's really hard when you're just like that, just in a moment of, oh no, what have I done? To be able to then switch yourself back and then calm yourself down. So how does kind of someone, perhaps when they've got like a deadline and people are pressure, how can we kind of get a little bit more control over that?
I'm going to answer that question in a second. bring me
Okay.
back to it, because I want to pick up on something. You made some really good points, and I want to just
Mm.
kind of dissect it a little bit. So when you said about the first thing is when we first have that realization of, oh, you know, there's this mistake or something's not as I expected, that can be a bit of a panic. Like the brain doesn't really like uncertainty, especially if it's like, I thought the world was like this and then it's not. Okay, the brain does, it unsettles it. It's like we literally lose our grounding. You know, and you find this if you know, in an extreme case, if people find, you know, if they find that they like they're going to be made redundant or something, you know,
Yeah.
if a spouse comes in and says, by the way, I've been having an affair or something like that. Like it's like my world was like this, and then suddenly everything I thought wasn't true, and that kind of thing can be tough. But obviously, it can happen on a small scale as well. I thought this was going to happen, and I've got these things. Oh, this thing's in the way. That's a problem. So that's like the threat response. Oh, what do I do with this? But then what you did was you moved from that case of that state of panic to accepting that's what's happened, that, you know, that is how
Mm.
reality is. Okay, so what can I do anyway? Like, what can I do
Mm.
now? And what you find with a lot of people who have you'll hear this a lot with people saying things like, oh, I just wish I shouldn't have done that, I really shouldn't have done that. Like they're stuck in the past regret, even on something like recent. If they make mistakes, people who struggle with self-criticism have this a lot. It's like, I just shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have done that. And it's like, you just dropped a pen. Like it's not a big deal. No, and I know I'm making light of that, but
Mm.
they're
Yeah.
stuck in that kind of, they can't accept that that's happened. So it's like, now what do you do? So you did that, but what really helps with that as well is the support. We're a social species, and we really do better when we feel accepted and supported. So if you're at work and you feel that there are, you know, if you feel your boss is supported, someone above you, and your team's supportive, it's a lot easier to deal with mistakes, problems, or challenges that come up, because you feel like you're in it together. There's
Mm.
quite a lot. There's they know now there's like neuroscience behind it, where if you get a little bit of like stress, it's challenge, and then if you go too much, we go into like a threat response, which is like fight, flight, freeze.
Mm.
But the way to inoculate against that is oxytocin. That's kind of, which is the connection hormone. That's why we always feel better when, you know, if you're having a problem and you either talk to someone about it just so you can get some connection with someone, or you say, mate, can you give me a hand with this? We always feel better if we've taken a challenge on with other people, because we don't feel alone with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it does really make a difference. And I know that, I mean, I've spoken to some of my clients that are in a situation whereby there's a lot of pressure on them, and they don't feel that they can approach anybody, you know. So like they and sometimes that might be because of their expectation on the situation. So it's like, you know, it's a bit of a self-imposed, perhaps, you know, in the nicest possible way, a feeling within them that they don't feel like they can, whereas actually in reality they
They
can.
could,
They can just
yeah.
reach out. But there are situations whereby I've spoken to people and they're, you know, their working environment is just so unsupportive, and actually quite like quite there's one woman in particular that I was speaking to, and her working environment just seemed very robotic, and almost like the company seemed to take the human aspect out of the employees, and they were watched all of the time. And you know, like if you were on instant messenger for more than a couple of minutes, somebody would actually message and say, what are you doing? Or if you were idle, you know, you'd get an instant message saying, what are you doing? And you know, that's
Wow.
like, I know, it was really extreme. And I kind of, I really struggled with that, because she ended up working there for she left, but in the end, but
Good.
she ended up working there. Yeah, I know, for a really long time. And I was really, really surprised that she was able to just kind of keep going with that, because it was harsh, really harsh. And she left and she ended up starting her own business, and now she's a lot happier and, and much, much, much happier. But, I think, and I think that's an extreme case, and thankfully, hopefully not too common. But in most cases, it's people's perception of what they can and can't or should and shouldn't do in a situation, and feeling like they can't approach somebody because maybe that might make them feel like they're not doing a good enough job, or they're like, maybe like makes them feel a little bit inadequate, when really it's just you're just a human being, and sometimes you just need to go, what was that?
But there's a couple of things there. It's always a question of, is it in my environment or is it my perspective? And what you talk about there, for me, there's the split. But we need a good balance between support and independence, because if you're too independent, you can be left alone with it, and that's the person who's left. And people will say we need self-starters, and then but then those self-starters could sometimes be left in a corner to deal with everything on their own, and then they feel unsupported. And of course, there's a difference there between feeling unsupported and then actually being unsupported, which is back to perspective versus environment. But then if you start over supporting people, that's when they end up in a tyranny, basically, where it's like you can't even send an instant message before someone's gone, what do you do that for? And then you start to feel pretty helpless, and you end up in a real victim mentality, because you're like, well, I can't use my independence here, or I have to specifically do what I need to do in line with what you're saying, or I'm going to get in trouble for it. And that causes stress of a different kind.
Yeah, it is really tough. I mean, we were speaking about this before, so I've done a lot of work on like my reaction to certain things, and looking at why because I do, like, it's not so bad, but like I have suffered from anxiety quite a lot, and what I actually learned was a lot of it was an unrealistic expectation upon myself. So it's like when I started to realize that I was just a human being, and therefore I can't be great at absolutely everything, but not only that is actually completely okay. That's absolutely okay. And started just to be a little bit more, especially in like the corporate environment, just being a little bit more open about that. Because what I actually found that then did was allowed other people to be a little bit more open about that, and this imposed expectation of how you should be in a certain environment then kind of started to loosen up a little bit.
Well, you show it's okay to be vulnerable. You show it's okay to be yourself, and then everybody can drop those expectations. I mean, interesting what you talk about. A lot of anxiety in that sense is really about, it tracks back to rejection, really. Like, as a social species, one of the worst fears for us is rejection. Because if you think back, in evolutionary terms, back in tribal times, if you were rejected from the tribe, you were screwed. It wasn't like, oh, I fell out with my mates, I'll move to a different city. It was like, no, you're out with the wolves, and you're going to get eaten. So there's a real
that pack mentality.
Yeah, well, when I'm looking at there's a real necessity to kind of make sure that we get on with people and that we're accepted, and it's why we feel good when we've got, if we've got a group of friends or a company we get on with, like you get clicks, or we feel that sense of belonging, that camaraderie, we feel good, because there's that sense of belonging. We need that to kind of to be alive.
Yeah, absolutely. If you were to, is what we'll wrap this up shortly, but like if you were to give anybody sort of like, say for instance, like, I don't know, like a top tip. Say for instance, they're at work, they're feeling the heat. They're they're under a lot of pressure. They've got a deadline. They've got people instant messaging them, pinging them emails. All that kind of shenanigans. And they can feel it getting on top of them. And as we know, over a long period of time, that can have complete detriment to your health, because your body doesn't have a chance to calm down again. It's always in fight or flight. Excuse me, losing my voice. What would be your top tip?
My top tip?
Yes.
The first step's always awareness, and something like that. So the problem is when we get into stressful thinking, we're looking at everything through a lens of stress. Like stress is basically means threat, right? If I'm stressed, it's because my mind is perceiving a threat. Now that might not always be clear the thing that's really made us anxious or stressed. And so if we are stressed, then suddenly everything we look at, I don't know if you've ever found it, but if you've got a lot on your to-do list, suddenly you find less time when you're really stressed, when there's a lot to do. And it's because we're in that stress state of mind. So suddenly I can't prioritize. I'm not sure. And I'm now worrying about the consequence of not doing that or doing that first, or what if. So the first thing is to be aware, that you're stressed. And then the next thing is to recognize that the stress is not coming from the stuff outside of you. It's what you think about it. It's what you're afraid is going to be true if you do or don't do that thing. And a good question people can ask is like, well, what does it mean if I don't do that? Like, what am I afraid of? When you start putting the attention back on yourself, and sometimes it can come back down to deeper, core beliefs. It's like, I'm afraid, I'll be rejected. I'm afraid they won't think I'm good enough. I'm afraid I'll look stupid, stuff like that. Now, I know that doesn't solve the problem, but it allows you to, then where the problem starts. And then the next tip I would say, once you're aware of that, is, well, two things. What can I do differently? What can I do? What can I actually do? And what could I do differently? Because if you're stressed, what you're doing now might not be working, because when we're stressed, we tend to do what we're doing, but harder. And possibly the thing that you're doing isn't actually working, which is why you're stressed. But the difficulty is when we can get a bit tunnel vision. So, we don't always see the blind spots we've got. For example, like you use the example of somebody who they could talk to their boss, but they don't feel they can. Now, if you say to them, talk to their boss, you'll get a, yeah, buts and no because. And that's where they need to get some they need to get some new, fresh thinking in, really, some new perspective. And that's why it can help to talk to somebody. And it doesn't have to be a professional necessarily. It can be someone they respect. It can be a friend. By talking things through, they might get a different perspective. The challenge then is, though, to catch themselves going, yes, but, and no, because. Because when the mind's really stressed, and especially if it's pushing on kind of core anxieties and fears, if someone says, well, why don't you just have a conversation with your boss? We really, really believe that I absolutely can't have a conversation with them because here's all the reasons. And for me, it's about getting into a space where we can start to reflect on some of those kind of rules and beliefs we have and question them and say, well, is that true? Or is there another way around this? Like, clearly, if I'm in a rock and a hard place and other people are saying that's not the case, surely there's something else I can do.
No, completely. So, like, I get this absolutely, because I've done a lot of work on like my behaviors, especially like when you start to, grow your own business and stuff. You have to get over your own, for want of a better phrase, shit, and so you can move forward. Otherwise, you're just gonna be met with the same hurdles. But I didn't do that alone. So I didn't all of a sudden become exceptionally aware of everything that I was doing and the reasons why just one day. I actually worked with people like yourself to help me get to that place. So how do people get hold of you?
So easiest way is probably through my website, which is dbch.co.uk. And going through there, you can find my socials and stuff like that. I mean, you can email me, but it's easier to send a message through my website, dbch.co.uk.
Lovely. And you've also got a stress busting freebie for people, which I have included the link on this chat. So if you are feeling the stress and you are, which I especially at the moment, I think that's absolutely everybody literally on the planet. So if you are feeling the stress and you want a little bit of help, or you are noticing behaviors where you are starting to self-sabotage yourself a little bit, or you can't get yourself out of this fight or flight or this stress kind of reaction, reach out to David, download his Stress Buster, speak to him, ask him some questions, because he is the guy that's going to be able to like switch switch how your mind works. So you start to identify. That's what I had to do. I had to identify what my things were, and then once I knew where it was all coming from, everything else just started to fall into place, because you can recognize it and go, oh, that's not actually that external problem that I have no control over. That's me. You know, so unfortunately, me again. So yeah, do get hold of him. All the links are there, and yeah, grab the help, people, because you know, I'm all for being an awesome human. And if you've got, you know, the help there, and if it's a problem for you, and if you can be a little bit less stressed, then that would be lovely, wouldn't it? So anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up. Thanks ever so much, David. It's been absolutely great.
Lovely to meet you.
You're welcome.